There comes a moment when life takes more than you think you can bear. One day the ground beneath you feels steady, and the next it gives way, leaving nothing but rubble where your dreams once stood. That was the moment he found himself at rock bottom, not just broke, not just lost, but empty in a way that words could barely describe. He had thought rock bottom would look dramatic, but in reality, it was quiet. Bills stacked up silently on the kitchen counter. His phone buzzed with unanswered calls he didn't have the courage to return. Food became scarce, and even the smallest tasks, brushing his teeth, leaving the house, facing people, felt like impossible battles. Rock bottom wasn't loud, it was suffocating silence. And yet, in that silence, he stumbled across the words of Marcus Aurelius. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. At first, those words felt like a cruel joke. What strength could be found here in this emptiness? But the more he read them, the more they began to settle inside him. Maybe rock bottom wasn't the end. Maybe it was the beginning. The place where he would learn to build resilience, not on comfort, but on character. The Stoics never promised a life without hardship. They promised a way to endure it, and even more, to use it. He didn't believe it yet, but he wanted to. And that small desire, that flicker of hope, was the first step toward something new. If you're listening now, maybe you've been there too. Maybe you're there right now. If so, stay. Subscribe to this channel, because here we walk together through these ancient lessons, not as distant philosophy, but as practical tools to rise from the lowest places. This isn't about pretending pain doesn't hurt. It's about learning to stand again, even when the weight feels unbearable. He thought the hardest part of hitting rock bottom would be losing everything around him. The job, the income, the plans. But what crushed him most was losing himself. Every morning, he woke up with the same weight in his chest, as if the simple act of opening his eyes was already too much. The mirror no longer reflected the man he used to be. Instead, it showed someone tired, ashamed, and unsure if he still had a place in the world. The silence was relentless. Friends stopped calling, opportunities stopped arriving, and even his own inner voice became cruel. It whispered, "You've failed. You'll never get back up." That voice was louder than any bill collector, harsher than any loss, and the more he listened, the deeper he sank. It was during one of those nights staring at the ceiling that he remembered a line from Epictetus. "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." He didn't want to believe it. How could reaction matter when reality felt so brutal? But slowly, the idea began to work on him. Maybe he couldn't control the storm around him, but he could control whether he let it drown him. So he started small. He didn't try to rebuild the entire world he had lost. Instead, he asked himself, "What can I do today? One thing, to move forward." Sometimes the answer was as small as making his bed, writing down a plan, or stepping outside for a few minutes of fresh air. Small steps, invisible victories, but each one whispered, "You are not finished." The Stoics called this self-mastery, and while the world measured him by what he had lost, he began to measure himself by what he chose each day. Not perfection, not success, just persistence. If you are here, maybe you know what that voice of despair sounds like. Maybe you felt it too. But remember this, the fact that you are listening now is proof that you haven't given up. That's where resilience begins, not in grand victories, but in refusing to let despair have the final word. He didn't rise with a roar of triumph. There was no cinematic breakthrough, no sudden rush of motivation that carried him out of despair. Instead, what came was quieter, almost invisible. A choice. The choice to do one thing, however small, instead of nothing at all. That morning, he opened a notebook, not to write some perfect plan, not to solve all his problems at once, but to remind himself of what was still his to control. His actions, his words, his response. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, separating what belongs to you from what doesn't. And when he looked honestly, he saw that while life had stolen much, it had not stolen everything. He couldn't erase his debts overnight, but he could choose not to collapse under their weight. He couldn't bring back lost opportunities, but he could prepare for the ones that might come tomorrow. He couldn't silence the judgment of others, but he could refuse to let their voices drown out his own. So he wrote 3 words on the page: I still can. They were simple, even fragile. But when despair told him he was powerless, those words stood as proof that he wasn't. That day, I still can, meant making 1 phone call. The next day, it meant walking outside for an hour. The day after that, it meant updating his resume. Small acts easily overlooked. Yet each one laid a brick, and brick by brick, a foundation was beginning to form. Rock bottom, he realized, wasn't just a place of loss. It was also a place of clarity. When everything unnecessary is stripped away, what remains is what truly matters: character, choice, courage. The world saw him as broken, but he was beginning to see himself as rebuilding. And maybe that's the lesson for you too. If you feel crushed under the weight of life, remember this: you don't need to climb the whole mountain today. You just need to take the next step. Because resilience isn't built in leaps. It's built in steps, repeated until they form a path out of the darkness. The Stoics believed that difficulties are not punishments but training. Seneca once wrote, "Difficulties strengthen the mind as labor does the body." At first, those words seemed cruel. Who would dare call this pain training? But slowly he began to understand. When he looked back, he realized that the moments of greatest growth in his life had never come during comfort. They had come during storms. Comfort had made him soft. Struggle was making him sharp. Rock bottom wasn't just suffering, it was a forge. And he was the iron being shaped by fire and hammer. So he changed the question he asked himself. Instead of "why me?" he began to ask, "What is this teaching me?" Each obstacle carried a hidden lesson. The loneliness taught him patience. The rejection taught him humility. The constant setbacks taught him discipline. And each lesson, though painful, added a new layer of strength he never would have gained otherwise. He realized that resilience wasn't born from avoiding pain, but from learning to walk with it. Like a soldier training with heavy armor, his burdens were preparing him for battles yet to come. The world thought he was being crushed, but in reality, he was being built. That night, he wrote a sentence in his notebook: "This is not punishment. This is preparation." And repeating those words gave him courage. Courage to endure, courage to see meaning in the hardship, courage to believe that this suffering wasn't the end of his story. It was the foundation of the next chapter. If you are listening now, maybe you too are in the middle of your own forge. It hurts, it burns, it feels endless. But remember this: the fire is not here to destroy you. It is here to shape you. And the person who emerges from it will be stronger, wiser, and more resilient than you ever imagined. One of the hardest truths he had to face was this: even when life takes almost everything from you, one thing always remains: your ability to choose your response. Epictetus knew this better than anyone. Once a slave, stripped of freedom and comfort, yet he taught that true freedom lies not in possessions or power, but in the mastery of oneself. At rock bottom, he finally began to understand. He couldn't decide when the bills would stop coming, but he could decide whether to face them with despair or with courage. He couldn't decide whether people would judge him, but he could decide whether their judgment would define him. He couldn't decide if life would throw another blow, but he could decide whether to meet it standing or broken. So he began to practice the art of choice. When shame told him to stay in bed, he chose to rise. When fear told him to remain silent, he chose to speak. When despair told him to give up, he chose even the smallest act of defiance. To take one step, to write one line, to breathe and keep going. At first, these choices seemed insignificant. No one noticed them. They didn't erase the pain or the struggle. But with each decision, something powerful began to grow inside him. Resilience, the quiet kind, the unshakable kind, the kind that doesn't shout but endures. The world measured him by what he had lost, but he began to measure himself by what he still chose. And in those choices, he discovered something the Stoics had always known. Fate controls the cards you are dealt, but you always choose how to play them. If you're listening now, remember this. Life can strip you of many things, but not of your will. That is your fortress, your weapon, your freedom. No storm, no loss, no failure can take that from you. He discovered that discipline wasn't about punishing himself. It was about protecting himself. Left unchecked, his mind wanted to spiral into endless what-ifs and why me. But discipline gave him structure, and structure gave him peace. So he created small rituals, waking up at the same time each day, no matter how heavy his body felt. Writing in his notebook every morning, even when his thoughts were chaotic. Stepping outside to walk, even when the sky was gray and the world felt hostile. These were not dramatic victories. They were quiet anchors, small acts of order in the midst of chaos. The Stoics taught that our character is shaped not by what we do occasionally, but by what we practice consistently. And as he practiced these rituals, something shifted. The days didn't feel random anymore. They began to feel like training. Training in patience, training in courage, training in the art of choosing action over despair. Through repetition, he discovered a truth. Discipline is not a chain, it is a shield. It does not restrict you, it frees you. It frees you from the tyranny of your emotions, from the storm of panic, from the weight of endless doubt. With each ritual repeated, he gained not just control over his day, but over himself. And this is the heart of resilience. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of strength built one habit at a time. If you feel like you're drowning, don't search for miracles. Build anchors. Small acts of discipline that remind you again and again that you are not powerless. Because every time you choose discipline, you are not just surviving the storm, you are learning how to walk through it without losing yourself. There were still days when the weight felt unbearable. Mornings when the thought of starting again seemed pointless. Nights when his mind whispered that all his effort was wasted. Rock bottom has a way of calling you back, of convincing you that no matter how far you've come, you'll always belong in the dust. But it was in those moments that he remembered Marcus Aurelius's words. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The obstacles weren't interruptions. They were the path. The struggle itself was shaping him. So he learned the quiet power of perseverance. Not flashy, not dramatic, but steady. He kept showing up for himself, even on the days he felt weakest. He wrote in his notebook when his hands shook. He walked in the rain, when his body begged for rest. He made the call even when fear tried to choke his voice. These were not grand victories, but they were proof. Proof that the storm hadn't won. Perseverance, he realized, was not about winning every day. It was about refusing to quit on any day. Even when tired, even when afraid, even when progress felt invisible. Each step, however small, was an act of defiance against despair. And as the days turned into weeks, something remarkable happened. He began to see himself differently, not as a victim of fate, but as a student of it. Every obstacle was a lesson, every failure a teacher, every setback a test of how badly he wanted to rise. If you are listening now, tired of fighting, ready to give up, remember this. Perseverance is not about feeling strong. It is about acting even when you don't. Strength follows action, and resilience is built not on comfort, but on the decision to keep walking when the road feels endless. What surprised him most was that resilience didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no single morning when he woke up and suddenly felt unbreakable. Instead, it unfolded quietly, hidden in the rhythm of ordinary days. He noticed it first in small details. His hands no longer trembled when he opened the mailbox. His voice carried less hesitation when he spoke to others. The shame that once weighed on every step had started to lift, piece by piece. He was not yet where he wanted to be, but he was no longer the man who had once been afraid of his own shadow. This was the silent transformation the Stoics had spoken of. Strength isn't something you wait for, it's something you practice into existence. Like drops of water carving stone, his habits, his choices, his discipline were reshaping him from the inside out. And the more he acted, the more he saw proof that rock bottom hadn't broken him. It had introduced him to a deeper version of himself. Others began to notice too. A friend asked him one day, "How do you keep going, even with everything stacked against you?" He didn't have a grand answer. He simply said, "I stopped waiting for life to get easier. I started working on becoming stronger." That honesty struck more deeply than any polished advice ever could, because resilience, he realized, was contagious. The courage to stand, even shakily, gives others permission to do the same. His suffering had become more than a personal battle. It had become a light, dim at first, but steady, guiding others through their own darkness. If you are listening, maybe your transformation is happening too, quietly, invisibly. Don't dismiss the small victories. They may feel insignificant now, but they are the seeds of strength you'll harvest later. One evening, he sat at his table with nothing but a notebook and the faint light of a candle. There were no riches in his pockets, no applause from the world, no outward signs of success. Yet for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel poor. He felt rich in a way that money could never measure. The Stoics had taught that true wealth is not found in possessions, but in virtue. Courage, wisdom, justice, and self-discipline. These are the treasures that no thief can steal, no fire can burn, no storm can wash away. And as he looked back on his journey, he realized that while life had stripped him of comfort, it had also given him these riches in abundance. Every time he rose when he wanted to stay down. That was courage. Every lesson carved into him by hardship. That was wisdom. Every act of honesty when lies would have been easier. That was justice. Every ritual practiced when no one was watching. That was discipline. By these measures, he was not broke. He was wealthy beyond measure. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." That night, those words rang true. He finally understood that resilience was not about waiting for the world to change. It was about learning to live well, no matter what the world gave or took away. If you are listening now, maybe you too have been chasing wealth the world can take. But remember, the deepest riches are the ones you carry inside. When you cultivate them, you become untouchable. You may lose possessions, titles, or recognition, but you will never lose yourself. He didn't climb out of rock bottom with a dramatic leap. He rose quietly, one step at a time, until one day he looked around and realized he was no longer the same man who had once been broken. The world had not suddenly become easier. The bills still came, challenges still arrived at his door, the rain still fell, but something far greater had changed. He no longer feared it. Resilience, he realized, was not about living without pain, but about mastering it. Life had tested him, stripped him, and reshaped him, and in the process he discovered the truth. The storms had not destroyed him, they had built him. Every struggle had forged strength. Every loss had carved wisdom. Every setback had trained discipline. This was the Stoic secret all along. That rock bottom is not the end. It is the beginning. The place where illusions are stripped away and where true character is formed. And the man who once thought he was finished now stood with a strength no storm could take. If you are listening to this, maybe life has knocked you down too. Maybe you feel like you've lost too much, like you're too tired to try again. But hear this. Your story is not over. The obstacle is not your enemy. It is your path. The very weight that feels unbearable today may be the fire that shapes you into someone unbreakable tomorrow. And if this message has spoken to you, if you have seen even a piece of yourself in this story, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but because here we walk together, through hardship, through resilience, through the wisdom that transforms suffering into strength. Because in the end, resilience is not about what you've lost. It's about what you've gained in the fire. And when you rise from rock bottom, you rise not as the same person you were before, but as someone stronger, steadier, and unshakable,